Welcome to meeting 130 of the Standing Committee on International Trade. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee on Monday, September the 23rd, 2024, the committee is resuming its study of recent developments concerning the Canada-United States softwood lumber trade dispute. How appropriate. We have with us today from the Canadian Home Builders Association, Kevin Lee, Chief Executive Officer, and Forest Products Association of Canada, Derek Nager, President and Chief Executive Officer. And by video conference from Unifor, we have Lana Payne, National President. Welcome to you all. Nice to see you again, Ms. Payne. And we will open up with Mr. Lee with an opening statement of up to 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, and good morning. I'm happy to bring perspectives to you from the Canadian Home Builders Association on your study. And as I'm here on behalf of CHBA and our 8,500 member companies from coast to coast, I'll focus my remarks on how the softwood lumber dispute impacts the residential construction industry. However, of course, it doesn't just impact the industry, but all Canadians. And as you are well aware, we're in a housing crisis. And in order to address this crisis, the federal government has estimated that to restore housing affordability, we'd need to build 5.8 million homes over the next decade, and a lot of lumber would be required to build those homes. Now, during the pandemic, lumber prices skyrocketed and lumber was in short supply. And while prices have come down off of those record highs, they still haven't returned to pre-pandemic levels. And really, any volatility in the lumber industry impacts residential construction, adding costs for builders and renovators, delaying construction times and closings, and exacerbating housing affordability challenges for consumers. According to CHBA's Housing Market Index, a leading indicator of current and future health of the residential construction industry, our 2024 Q3 results show that for a 2,400 square foot home, lumber costs are still about $26,000 more than they were pre-pandemic. Meanwhile, other construction materials surged as lumber costs waned, and normal rates of inflation for building materials continue to compound the cost increases, further eroding housing affordability. South of the border in the U.S., price escalation on lumber has been made even worse thanks to the U.S. tariffs on Canadian lumber. Our American counterparts, the National Association of Home Builders, or NAHB, continue to fight these tariffs given their impacts on construction costs in the U.S. NAHB continues to call on the U.S. government to suspend tariffs on Canadian lumber imports and to move immediately to enter into negotiations with Canada on a new softwood lumber agreement that will eliminate those tariffs altogether. As the dispute lingers on, CHBA asks that the federal government support the lumber supply chain to maximize supply security, output, and delivery, and of course to seek a timely resolution to the trade dispute that serves Canada well, which, while difficult under the circumstances, is paramount. CHBA also asks that the government work with the domestic lumber producers to maintain and in the future be able to ramp up production by working with other levels of government to ensure more responsive and certain access to raw materials. We encourage continued collaboration with the lumber industry on key issues of securing certainty for sustainable lumber supply for domestic fiber. And it's also important to understand that there is a need for liquidity for the lumber industry to survive this tariff period, and there is likely a role for the federal government to play there, though we will leave that to our lumber industry colleagues to detail. So I'm glad to see Mr. Derek Nager here today from FPAC. It's also important to recognize that all industries, including lumber and home building, are facing more and more excessive red tape. There is a growing fatigue within the Canadian business climate that ever-growing amounts of red tape regulation and bureaucracy continue to be compounded, and this frustration is causing the business environment to move capital elsewhere. In lumber, it's investing in other countries. In home building, investors are looking at other countries with more attractive opportunities in purpose-built rental and even condo and land development rather than in Canada. We need those investment dollars to build the 5.8 million homes Canada needs, and to that end, we need regulations streamlined. In home building, the federal government has just launched a consultation on a proposed tax on vacant land. This concept shows a clear misunderstanding of the realities of the land development and home building sector and is an example of inefficient regulation that could cost home owners and home buyers a lot of money in the future. We also need to loosen up all of the red tape restricting getting more homes built in general. There are some good moves afoot on policy change, which is good, but we'll need more. And while more housing, if successful, means more use of Canadian lumber, which is good, I should also add that the move to more and more mid and high-rise construction doesn't necessarily correspond to the same increase in lumber usage. While we are introducing tall wood into the building codes, we still have to find a way to make it more cost competitive. In the absence of better cost competitiveness, we will see steel and concrete continue to dominate taller construction. We also need to clear the way for more low-rise construction, which can still be higher density, is primarily wood-based, and is the type of housing most Canadians prefer. The ongoing uncertainty between Canada and the U.S. on the softwood lumber dispute can have major impacts on lumber prices and supply here in Canada. Instability with supply and prices will impact residential construction jobs, the sector's contribution to economic activity, and continue to exacerbate housing affordability challenges for consumers. CHBA urges the government to continue to fight hard for a positive resolution to this dispute. Thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you very much. Mr. Nibor, for up to 5 minutes, please.
Great. Thanks, Madam Chair, and thank you for the opportunity. And I'll say on behalf of our sector and its people, we do appreciate all the dialogue and the efforts being made on both sides of the House. It's a really difficult time for our sector, and I'm happy today to talk a little bit about the landscape and then take your questions after. FPAC, as you know, represents Canada's wood, pulp, paper, and wood bioproducts manufacturers across the country. We're a $97 billion a year industry that exports more than half of what it makes, and we directly employ some 200,000 Canadians. I'm grateful that Lana and Kevin are here today. CHB and Unifor are two key partners and thoughtful voices for employees and the broader forest sector value chain. Despite the increased tariffs, the mills closed, the jobs lost to date, make no mistake about it, this sector has a lot of promise. There's much more we can do and many more jobs we can create. And while the realities of today are sadly against the backdrop of decline and massive trade risk, it doesn't have to be this way. I view this testimony as an opportunity to get our federal government to think about us more strategically, to end the game of whack-a-mole policy development that runs counter to how forest-based economies in other countries that are growing, countries like the US, Brazil, Finland, and Sweden. The World Bank forecasts that global timber demand will quadruple by 2050. Where do we want to get this timber from? Driven by global population growth and the want to build towns and cities around the world with clean, renewable materials. Global demand is growing. International customers value wood products coming from Canada. Our industry should be getting bigger, not smaller, as we consider the global opportunity over the next couple of decades. And we're the only building material sector whose products grow back. Another unique thing about our industry, and I can't be here without talking about our pulp and paper industry, our sawmills, our lumber mills need our pulp and paper mills. I think about Ontario, for example. Back in 2000, we had 15 pulp and paper mills in Ontario. We now have 3. These pulp and paper mills are a critical off-ramp for our sawmills to sell their chips and other residuals to, ensuring that every part of the harvested tree creates value. And we're not running out of trees. Yet from 2004 to 2022, we've seen a nearly 40% reduction in wood harvested in Canada. 45% down in BC, 50% down in Ontario, 38% down in Quebec, 66% down in Nova Scotia. And let's not forget that as harvesting activity declines, it impacts forest health and resilience. And there's an imperative here, too, to consider for improved public safety, a reduction in the number of community evacuations, an avoidance of declining air quality in the summer, and the mitigating of the risk of more carbon emissions from fire. Canada's Forest National Inventory Report will show you that across Canada's boreal forest, that more than 60% of the trees now are between the ages of 61 and 140 years old. These are trees and forests that are aging and approaching end of life. And if harvesting volumes continue to fall, we're going to face an even greater risk of catastrophic fire across the Canadian boreal in out years. And unfortunately, little to none of this has been considered as part of the climate and national adaptation plans of the federal government. It's a huge miss, and it's offside with how other leading forested countries are thinking. In the Q&A, I look forward to discussing some of the big plays to address the current trade risks. I think about getting those trade panels working and overcoming the ineffectiveness of legal challenges, which you've heard about from some of my colleagues in recent weeks, addressing the job impacts and the financial burden of increasing duties, considering important regional trade plays like the relationship between BC and Alberta with California and the relationship on trade that Ontario and Quebec have with New York. Working with Kevin, CHBA, and others to make our sector a gateway to building more affordable homes, making Canada a global leader in mass timber manufacturing, and driving value and supporting heat and power generation by using low-grade wood. I'll close on market diversification. In the past 20 years, Canada Wood has been the private-public partnership that's worked really well to help us diversify markets with a big focus on Asia. And I know there's been some talk about diversification at this committee. Over the years, it's generated $15 of benefit for every single dollar spent, not to mention its support of over 14,000 jobs dependent on offshore shipments. Well, unfortunately, it saw its success met with a federal budget cut during last year's budget period, forcing Canada Wood to reduce 85% of its staff. Its once $12 million diversification budget is now at less than $4 million. We've got lots to discuss. We remain in the solution space. Our employees and forest-dependent communities want action. I appreciate the committee looking at this with solutions in mind and meeting us where we're at, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. On to Ms. Payne, please.
Great. Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and good morning to you and your fellow members of the Standing Committee on International Trade, members of Parliament, and of course my fellow presenters, and I thank them for their comments this morning as well. I'm Lana Payne, and I'm the National President of Unifor. We are Canada's largest private sector union with more than 320,000 members across the country working in every major sector of the Canadian economy, including the forestry industry. Our 22,000 forestry sector members are spread across 10 Canadian provinces, working in a variety of forestry and logging occupations, as well as wood product and pulp and paper manufacturing facilities. Quebec has the highest concentration of forestry membership in our union, accounting for about 55% of our overall sectoral membership, while Ontario and British Columbia account for 22% and 14% respectively. And of course, we have very important mills and operations in Atlantic Canada and the prairies. I'd like to remind the committee that while the softwood lumber dispute poses a clear and present danger, Canada's forest sector continues to experience a perfect storm of repeated and intersecting crises. A combination of economic, environmental, and global challenges continue to destabilize the broader forestry sector. Forest fires were less destructive this year, but still very bad. Important conservation efforts continue to complicate long-term planning for the sector. Volatile and flat prices are still making companies think and rethink their investments, and new EU regulations could negatively impact the ability of Canadian forest products to be sold in that market and around the world. All these crises have been disastrous for forestry workers, their families, and communities. The recent doubling of combined tariff duty rates and the looming threat of further incoming increases are a devastating blow to Canada's forestry sector. We fear we will see workplace closures as a result of these continued increases. And this is without contemplating the additional 25% across-the-board tariff threatened by President-elect Trump, which, if imposed, would cause major problems in the sector. I think we all know this. Forest sector stakeholders in Canada have not always formed a united front on this issue, and this is particularly true of some of the forest companies themselves. For example, we are deeply concerned to see some Canadian forest companies divest investments into their U.S. operations while pulling up stakes here in Canada and abandoning their Canadian operations. However, it's important to recognize that playing the blame game won't help forestry workers and their families, and the hundreds of communities across our country that rely on forestry for their survival. The fundamental challenge we face is the overwhelming imbalance of power in our trade relationship with the United States. No amount of finger-pointing or blame-shifting here in Canada will change the fact that the U.S. controls all the chips in this dispute at the moment. But certainly, not all hope is lost. I agree with Derek on this. Despite the increase in output by U.S. softwood producers, U.S. lumber companies still don't have enough capacity to meet all of that country's lumber needs. The U.S. home building industry, as you've heard, still needs Canadian softwood, and these punishing tariffs are driving up construction costs and making home ownership less affordable for working Americans. We have allies in our fight, and we have reasonable arguments to be made in our favor. It is critical that our elected leaders, governments across the country, forest workers and their unions, and other forestry stakeholders come together and focus on finding solutions to this unfortunate and unnecessary dispute. I would like to close my comments on a note of hope and optimism, which are in short supply these days in the forestry sector discussions. The softwood lumber dispute drives home the simple fact that Canada's forestry sector is over-reliant on first-order raw resource extraction. We have an incredible opportunity to promote, support, and invest in higher-level production where we can create value-added forest products and systems right here in Canada. Innovative products and systems like engineered wood products, mass timber frame construction, modular components, and biofuels represent an incredible opportunity to actually grow the sector, create new forestry jobs, and increase economic development and productivity. What we need is a coordinated, comprehensive, and inclusive industrial strategy to help transform our forestry sector, an ambitious and bold redevelopment strategy, if you will. This will require a whole sector team approach involving governments at all levels, forest companies and industry groups, Indigenous communities, academics and experts, forestry schools, and of course, forestry workers and their unions and local communities. And not only will this transformation mean better jobs, more sustainable forests, and more responsible economic development, it will also better insulate us from the ongoing threat of continued softwood tariffs. Thank you very much, and I too welcome all your questions.
Thank you to the witnesses. On to Mr. Seaback for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. It's nice to be back at the International Trade Committee after a brief hiatus. What's interesting to me is that we did a study when I was on this committee over a year ago on softwood lumber, which was an updated study from a few years before that on softwood lumber, which updated a study a few years before that on softwood lumber. And despite all of this, there's been really zero progress on resolving the softwood lumber dispute. And, you know, this has real consequences. And it's had real consequences for workers, as you mentioned, Ms. Payne, and their families. I'm wondering if you have any idea or any thoughts about what would be the benefit to workers if the dispute was resolved and the $9 billion in tariffs were returned to companies that could invest in the bold strategy, redevelopment strategy that you've just talked about.
Thank you. Thank you, Kyle. Thank you for that question. Obviously, we have, because of these other crises that are across the sector, when you add the tariffs on top of that, the new ones that we've just received, and potentially the 25% tariff that the president-elect is talking about, and by the way, potentially another 15% next year, the sector cannot carry on with these kinds of duties and tariffs looming and over their head. And we have businesses right now, I would say to you, because of a whole bunch of factors, softwood being one of them, that are on the brink. And so they have to consider or reconsider whether they can actually make investments. And that's the scary part. So to your point, if there was an additional $9 billion back into the sector, this would certainly help us maintain and sustain many of the businesses that are out there today, employing a lot of uniform members, thousands of them all across this country. But in addition to that, I think we have to look, as you've mentioned, to the long term about how it is that we have a coordinated development strategy for the sector going into the future. And that's critical too. So we're not looking at this in a piecemeal way, but planning it in a much more consistent fashion, and this will benefit workers and the communities in which they live.
Ms. Payne, I'm sure you're aware that the softwood lumber industry combined called on the government to appoint a special envoy to try and negotiate a resolution of this. And During the last study, we discovered shockingly that this request for a special envoy to be appointed by industry sat on the minister's desk actually for 15 months without any kind of a response. And in our committee report in 2023, there was actually a recommendation that was accepted by the committee and put to the government that the Government of Canada appoint an official softwood lumber emissary for Canada to engage with the United States to enhance Canada's efforts designed to encourage the U.S. administration to negotiate a resolution to the current softwood lumber dispute. That was a year ago, plus the 15 months before that when it just sat in limbo. And here we are today with no resolution. Are you surprised at all by the government's lack of action on this recommendation and the recommendation of committee, which has led to some of the challenges we're seeing?
I think that there are a lot of challenges right now in terms of trying to negotiate a settlement with the U.S. That was true of the past year and the past number of years, and it's certainly going to be true going forward. I think any and all efforts that can be put in place to try and negotiate something is important. But I also believe that there is a role for us to play in Canada as well. And when I say us, I mean the entire forestry industry in Canada and the unions that represent workers across the sector. And we have to have a common approach. It's very difficult, I would say, for a government envoy to negotiate an agreement that benefits Canada if we can't get industry on the same page. And that has been part of the challenge. So anything that you can do as well, and this committee can do, and government can do to help industry reach a consensus on where a negotiating standpoint should come from, I think would be helpful to getting to a resolve. It's on all of us, is what I'm saying.
You mentioned in your opening statement a bold redevelopment strategy, not just for wood harvesting, but for the industry as a whole. I'm sure you've conveyed your desire for that strategy to the government. Have you had any real response from the government, or are you seeing any action from the government on the bold redevelopment strategy that would benefit companies, workers, and workers' families?
We have been actually saying this about a number of key industries, Kyle, in terms of, we've been very front and center on the auto industry, on the aerospace industry, on the energy industry. We have workers in every sector, forestry being one of the most important ones as well. And we've been promoting with all levels of government the need for a coordinated industrial strategy. That means the federal government working with provincial governments so that we can get there. And I would say I would like to see a lot more progress than we've made on this front. So there's lots of work to be done, but we can't stop pushing here. We have to get to a place. There are hundreds of rural communities, particularly in our country, who are depending on all of us right now to be able to get to a place where the industry can survive and thrive going into the future. And this means good union jobs for workers from one coast to the other.
Thank you very much. Mr. Miao for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for being here today. Through you, Madam Chair, I'd like to ask my first question to Mr. Lee. The softwood lumber dispute has been an ongoing issue for over 25 years, and the WTO has typically favored Canada's position. Would you agree it has been a challenge for whichever government that has been in negotiation?
Yeah, I think it's been a nonstop play repeat kind of thing every time the negotiations come to the fore. The international tribunals seem to always favor Canada's position, yet the United States continues to do what it does. So it's a big challenge, and it's not new.
And what do you suggest would be helpful to Canadian official in potential negotiation too?
Well, I do think that the Team Canada approach is very important, and it's very difficult. Even in our federated model, I remember a few years ago we were strategizing with our American colleagues at NAHB, and they mentioned one of the challenges is even just having the different provinces look to negotiate their own deals while trying to also negotiate a national deal. So bringing together a Team Canada is hugely important. I think also making sure it's a good deal for Canada at this stage is hugely important, not only in the short term, but in the long term. And then lastly, I would say, as you've heard from other witnesses, I think we really need to figure out what we can do to be less reliant on raw materials going to the States and finding competitive ways to create a stronger industry here in Canada that supplies Canada, sure supplies the States, and also looks to other markets around the world that are going to need more lumber products as well.
Thank you. And would other witnesses want to chime in on this? Mr. Neighbor?
Yeah, no, I think I agree with everything Kevin has said.
Great. Earlier in your opening remark, you talk about our housing crisis, and I'd like to talk about the Home Accelerator Fund, which is a $4 billion investment which is expected to lead to a construction of over 750,000 new homes in Canada over the next decade. Do you believe that association like yours, that the HAF would be a good investment, also addressing to the current housing crisis?
Yeah, I think the most important thing about the Accelerator Fund is the way it's going after municipal processes and delays and zoning and all of those things. And while, the funds were sort of directed to municipalities to use in ways that they would choose, including for affordable housing and the like, the biggest problems that we're seeing in getting more housing built are around municipal delays, development charges, permitting challenges, zoning, all of these things. So I think it's really important that we continue to use all the levers we have at federal and provincial levels to ensure that municipalities do all that they can to enable more housing to be built.
Thank you. And next, I'd like to ask Mr. Neighbor, what do you believe the main challenge in resolving the current the lumber dispute, and what do you believe an agreement with the U.S. that will benefit Canadian softwood lumber industry should look like?
Yeah, I'll say there's a lot of talk about getting a deal done, but it's got to be the right deal for Canada, and that's the challenge here. And the other challenge here is that the folks on the other side of the border know how tough it is in Canada right now. And anytime you're trying to negotiate, when you know the other side is having a bit of a tough time, that's a very difficult position to be in. And I feel that for our mills and for our employees and for those communities. And I think we got to look at two tracks. I like what Lana was talking about. We've got the here and the now, the immediate. We've got, as you heard from some other witnesses from the sector, we have some mills, especially smaller, medium size, a lot of family-owned mills that are really near the edge of the cliff right now. Like, what can we do to help them? And I hesitate to go in a lot of detail publicly in negotiating because that's problematic as well. So, but all I'll say is I believe that Global Affairs knows well the sensitivities there. And the looming liquidity crisis that is before a lot of our mills in this country right now, if this continues. The other thing I'm worried about longer term is, depending on where the Trump tariffs go, our industry is very reliant on a strong U.S. home building network to drive our businesses. And we are expecting, getting into next year, things are starting to look better in terms of U.S. housing starts. But if we have broad-based inflation again in the U.S. over the next couple of years because of big tariffs, that's going to delay that because those housing starts are not going to be where we think they need to be. So those are a couple things we're watching. The other thing I would say, Lana talked about it, market diversification, the promise of the forest bioeconomy, mass timber, government procurement, reinvesting again in export market diversification. These are all, we need to do the here and now piece, but we also need to do the piece for the medium and long term to sustain and grow our sector for tomorrow.
Thank you. And can you speak to the work that our government has done with the softwood lumber industry to develop a strong, unified Canadian negotiation position, and how is this been vital to our engagement with the U.S.?
Yeah, I'll say, and to Lana's point as well around, there has been there's not always absolute unanimity across the lumber sector in this space. That's been the way it's always been, but the companies are working together with their value chain partners and with the government to try to build this Team Canada approach. So I'm happy to see the dialogue that's happening there. I think that's absolutely critical. We also need to remember the role the provinces play here. More than 90% of the land that our foresters are operating on are under the purview of the provinces. So those provincial voices become very important as well. I think, again, I'm very careful about not negotiating against ourselves and not doing that publicly. But I will say that it is a really dire time right now, especially for a lot of our smaller and mid-sized mills. And I think you heard that from my colleagues from Ontario and Quebec last week.
Mr. Savard-Tremblay for 6 minutes, please.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to all of our witnesses for your opening statements, and thanks for sounding the alarm on this situation. It's been 40 years that we've known about this, and this has become sort of background noise in terms of an issue that's never being resolved. Mr. Lee, my first question will be for you. I would imagine that because you are with the Canadian Home Builders Association, we know that there's the National Home Builders Association in the U.S. I would imagine that you work with them or talk with them, and they are strongly opposed to these duties. And we know that this is an association that's close to the Republicans, closer to the Republicans than to the Democrats. With this new situation, I would imagine that you've had exchanges with them. Have they shared with you some concerns about certain aspects or other aspects that could be more positive? Could you share something on this for me?
Merci beaucoup pour la
Thank you very much for the question.
Merci beaucoup.
I don't know if there are a lot of positive elements pertaining to this. I will go to English now.
With our discussions with NAHB, sure, I think it's pretty common for most industry associations to typically be more aligned with a Republican government, you know, smaller government type situations. They are pretty unwavering, though, in their recognition of the importance of Canadian lumber to the U.S. home building market. And so I don't expect that will change in terms of their calls for complete elimination of the tariffs. I mean, there's no question that the number one damage that gets done on the tariffs is actually to the U.S. home buyer, and then in turn to the U.S. home builder who can sell less homes, as Derek was alluding to, you know, if we see high lumber prices. And don't forget that these tariffs, of course, result in higher prices in the U.S. across the board, not just on Canadian lumber, but it allows the U.S. Lumber industry to charge much more. So I do expect a continued call. I think by the same token, though, recognizing the challenges, we have seen a call for more diversification of the U.S. market to look to other countries. And so we are seeing that, which is obviously dangerous for Canada as well. So I think they're being realistic, much like we in Canada need to be realistic in terms of diversifying how we handle our lumber industry, how we add more value and create more opportunities to export, because the challenge, I think, will continue. I don't know, to the point earlier, hasn't this been going on for a long time? Yes, it probably will go on into the future. Hopefully we'll get that trade settlement, and probably the next time it comes to renegotiate, it'll probably be back to the same business. So the more we can do to solidify our own situation, the better, I think, moving forward.
Merci. Bien maintenant, Jean.
Thank you. Now, we know that on their end, Canadian lumber and Quebec lumber is critical. It's critical for home building, for example, and to prevent an increase in prices. Now, we know that there are a lot of Americans who are struggling to buy homes. On the Canadian side, I'd be interested in knowing what's the ratio in terms of local lumber and foreign lumber when we're building homes.
Have those statistics close at hand. We could definitely look at it. Derek might know a little bit as well. Do you have it off the top of your head?
Yeah, I don't, but I will say it's mostly Canadian. We did see a bit of a surge of EU lumber coming in a little while ago, but it's the large majority is Canadian lumber.
Est-ce que peut-être, puis pour vous deux d'ailleurs.
A question for both of you. How can we further explain the negative relationship between tariffs and housing starts? Your building. We know that this industry has an impact on what you do, but one may think that this is an exterior problem that's more, that would have a greater effect on the U.S. So can you explain this link, please?
Well, I think the thing about the lumber industry in North America is it's a North American market, despite the fact that we have these tariffs and everything else, or as a result of the tariffs, it really is a North American market, and so our prices fluctuate accordingly. And we saw that through COVID. You know, when there was so much demand both north and south of the border, lumber prices went way up. So when we look to the future, I think the biggest danger here would actually be a Canadian lumber industry that suffers so much that we see a shrinking of the Canadian lumber industry. And then when things pick up, we don't have the capacity in our own lumber industry to supply Canada properly and the opportunities south of the border. So that's why it's so critical that we help our lumber industry survive, because we do expect we're going to come out of our current state. We do expect to start building more houses. And if the mills have shut down and aren't capable of reopening, that's a huge issue for Canadian housing, for Canadian home building, for Canadian house prices looking ahead.
Monsieur, combien, pardon?
How long? Okay, we'll try to go quickly. Mr. Nibor, there's something I'm trying to understand. We struggle to export with these tariffs, but we do use a lot of American wood in our home building stores. Why is that?
It's majority Canadian lumber being sold in Canada. I can offline get the numbers for you, but we do run the risk as we start losing capacity about the opportunity to provide for ourselves in out years, which would be a shame given the bounty of our forest resources and our commitment to sustainable management.
Thank you very much. Mr. Desjardins for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you to the very good statements made by the witnesses today, Mr. Lee, Mr. Nibor, and Madam Payne. It's good to see you in particular, Ms. Payne. I know that you've been often a champion for workers, a champion for industrial strategy, something that New Democrats, we've been consistent on for decades, as a matter of fact, something that we deeply believe in, this history we have in Canada, where we have companies, and I come from Alberta, where we have a lot of these kinds of companies that are taking the raw resource and then exporting that raw resource. Albertans rightfully ask, why not have our own refineries? Why not have our own manufacturing in order to make certain that we can not just sell to other markets raw materials, but also sell to Canadians those raw materials, well, with value added? I think that's something we deeply believe in. When we think about gasoline, for example, majority of that comes from the United States. If you weren't aware of that, I know that Mr. Nibor, you come from the West, you know that. We have these massive exports of our goods, and then we import them at a premium to Canadians. So when Ms. Payne, when you talk about this value-added industrial strategy, that would meet hopefully, management and labor, unite them towards a united position and put them on the same page, as you say, towards a common goal, that hopefully have the max benefit for not just Canadian industry, Canadian union jobs, but also Canadians. It's a deep matter of affordability. It's a deep matter of planning our industries accordingly. And it's something that Canadians need to do in a world and an environment that's hyper-protectionist. So my first question, which is, I think, a basic one, which I would like each of your opinions on, is this more recent change. In the last 40 years, we've largely benefited from free trade, the globe, North America in particular. Now we're witnessing this very unfortunate reality where protectionism, particularly American protectionism, is deeply becoming ingrained in their political culture. We've seen that with Democrats just recently raising the tariff rate, for example, on softwood lumber to 14%. That was Democrats who did that. Now we're seeing Republicans, who are supposed to be champions of free trade, come in with the most historic and extreme version of protectionism we've ever seen. 25% on all goods. This is extreme. This is a very disappointing position for us to be in. But I really take exception and benefit from Ms. Payne's remarks about the opportunity that's present. The opportunity to look at our industries here in Canada, the opportunity to look at what our needs are, and the opportunity to retool and save our industries. I know, Mr. Nibor, you have mills. I've spoken to some workers in your riding, in particular on the island of Vancouver Island, 2 mills in particular. Those 2 mills are in deep water. They're in a tough situation. They've done a lot of things right. They've made certain that their workers are protected. They've made certain that these rural northern communities actually have a chance. But what's not working for them is the fact that every market they try to get to is blocking them. We need to find ways to create security for them here at home. I know my colleague Gord Johns, who's a fantastic advocate for you in particular, but also for your industry and for many of the industries in British Columbia, speaks to us about the importance of a tax credit, biomass tax credit in particular, that could soften that blow on biomass products. Can you speak to the importance of why a biomass tax credit today would be critical to ensuring that some of these businesses can keep their products, but also have an advantage for those products in the market, Mr. Nybor?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. So when the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act came out a couple of years ago, one of the responses to that, we know we can't go dollar for dollar in tax credits with the U.S., but one of the responses for our sector was an investment tax credit for heat and electricity generation and the use of biomass, and we're still waiting. It's been over 2 years. And that's just to deal with the IRA impacts, which we're 2 years in on, not to mention all these other diversification. Let's move up the value chain. And I'll say with the value chain, like that's great. It's important, but you need a stable, solid primary industry to be able to grow up the value chain. And right now we don't have that. And so I don't think you're going to get any opposition in our industry about the opportunity to do more and add value here in Canada. But we're in a fundamental position now where when the primary industry is unstable, we got to stabilize the industry and we can walk and chew gum at the same time. Yeah, but we got to stabilize where we're at right now.
Yes, so it's in many ways, don't mean to be facetious, but deep roots are required here for our industry in order to make sure it's stable, so that by the time, of course, we can reap the benefits of that immense labor and the good production, that we actually see the max benefit. Ms. Payne, I'd like to speak to you about the importance of ensuring that we have workers represented in this discussion, workers at the forefront of the discussion, workers at the center of all of this work. Canadian labor is really what's most important here in my mind. You mentioned some of the risks that were related to some of the companies and how they're managing this risk. They're offshoring their domestic revenue to their American bases, which isn't very good for workers here. It's not good for jobs here. It's not good for Canadian affordability here. Why is it so important to make sure that workers here in Canada are at the forefront and center of any plan that would unify us towards our negotiation position with the United States for these tariffs and others?
A very brief response.
Well, of course, we need to make workers central to all these discussions. It is their jobs and their communities, after all, that are at risk. I do believe if we focus on developing industrial strategies in the climate that we're in, we're going to be much more resilient in Canada, and our economy will be much more resilient, and so will be those sectors in which we do this great work. And so more industrial strategies now.
Thank you very much. Mr. Martel for 5 minutes, please.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for your presence here today. Mr. Lee. So, lumber producers are directly impacted by these tariffs. They have to raise their prices to make up for these export losses. I'd like to know, how does this affect housing affordability, specifically for home buyers who are at a low income level?
Yeah, certainly fluctuations in lumber price affect everybody. Those at the lower end of the affordability spectrum tend to be impacted more, of course. And the strange thing is about the way the situation could work. In some cases, tariffs might end up lowering prices initially in Canada because of lack of demand. The problem then becomes if we then have to shut down mills and then to balance the supply-demand equation, and then prices stabilize or start to go up, and then we hopefully increase at some point. We're looking to increase housing supply, and then there's more pressure on lumber prices in Canada, and they go up even further. So it's a very tricky and precarious position that we're currently in. And it affects everybody on the spectrum. It affects the lower income Canadians. It affects anybody looking to move up. It affects those looking to provide affordable housing, social housing, because their costs go up exactly the same way. So it's definitely a big challenge.
Mr. Lee, with a government that states that they want to increase housing affordability, they say that this is their priority. In my opinion, they're failing on some critical elements such as lumber. Do you think that these contradictions are harmful to trust in the industry's trust, rather, in federal policy?
There's definitely the good and the bad when it comes to policy at all levels of government. And so right now, we look at the lumber dispute that's been ongoing, and it's challenging. There's no question it's challenging. I think every government, and we have a new election, I'm sure it'll be top of the list, no matter who's in power next, to be pursuing this. But we really need all hands on deck. But as we've heard from everybody, it's complicated. On the housing policy front at large, we need all three levels of government playing their part to increase housing supply and address affordability. Could we do more? Of course. Is there more policy levers that we need to make use of? Of course. So we appreciate the attention on the subject and expect a lot more to be done moving forward.
Si la situation des tarifs reste
If the tariff situation does not change, I'd like to know what will be the long-term effects on the home building industry in Canada and the entire industry.
Well, again, that depends a lot with how the lumber industry reacts to the situation, right? Because there's no question we're a wood-based home building industry. We rely heavily on Canadian lumber. I don't have the statistics exactly, but I know, as Derek alluded to, we're practically close to, really high numbers in terms of Canadian lumber. And so the impacts on affordability and access to housing are going to be very much a function of how well the industry can survive and balance the equation in terms of supply and demand. So the types of supports to keep our industry moving forward are going to be absolutely critical. And if things, if things didn't go well, to answer your question, if mills started shutting down and everything, that would be disastrous for Canada, I think, in the long term, because we'd become, ironically, relying on importing lumber, which seems unthinkable in this country, but there comes a point where that could be a greater possibility, and our supply of and percentage of Canadian lumber and houses would go down, which would be, I think, catastrophic for all.
40.
Monsieur Derek, juste parce que vous avez parlé d'investissement.
So you spoke about investments that companies should have to make. It's difficult for a company to make such investments when there is such uncertainty surrounding the market. Would you agree?
Yeah, I agree. And I also say measures like the one in your community around caribou recovery, a plan that could put thousands of people out of work. That is destabilizing investment in Quebec. That's not helping. We need predictable access to the land base, and that's another business concern on top of all of this.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sidhu.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks to our witnesses for joining us today on this very important study. As you guys are aware, our government has a very ambitious plan to build close to 4 million homes, working with provincial and municipal partners. Mr. Lee, you mentioned the need to loosen red tape in getting more homes built. You mentioned the Housing Accelerator Fund. And that Housing Accelerator Fund is doing just that. It's streamlining permitting, helping municipalities build more infrastructure, get more sewer and water linage into the ground so more housing can be built. In the city of Brampton, Brampton MPs worked together to secure roughly $114 million for the city of Brampton to build over 20,000 homes. Now, this funding is given out in sections, so 25% of that has been allocated, and $85 million is now on the table at stake here. Mr. Poilievre has mentioned that he's going to cancel the Housing Accelerator Fund, which has led to mayors across Ontario really angry because this funding has been allocated. And some of the mayors have come back and said this could lead to increase in property taxes. This could lead to projects being canceled. This could lead to many thousands of homes not being built. I was just talking to my colleague here, Mr. Mao, and he's a Richmond, BC MP, and he was talking about how the Housing Accelerator Fund has enabled their city to help streamline the construction of many homes. Now, you mentioned that different partners have a role to play. We repeatedly hear that the leader of the opposition, Mr. Poilievre, attacked municipalities. Just this past weekend, he said this. He said, Trudeau will give more and more to incompetent, greedy, money-hungry municipal politicians. We know on this side of the table we need to work with, whether it's the provinces or municipalities, to enable more home construction. What would you have to say, and what role would the municipalities have to play in enabling more work for your members and getting homes built?
Well, there's no question that we need continued change at the municipal level in terms of policies, programs, the way they do things. I think that we're starting to see that change in some places, not all places, but some places. And I think the attention that's been put on this issue by the federal government and provincial governments has been critical to make that happen. So in order to keep moving in that direction, we're going to need policies of that nature moving forward. In the best scenario, the municipalities and the industry and all three levels of government are working all together to drive more supply. In reality, sometimes that takes some twisting. And in fact, in some ways, when you look at the opportunities for the federal government's in a great place to fight NIMBYism, actually. The people who have the hardest time fighting NIMBYism are municipal councillors and mayors. Why? Because when they put these things in place and they have their own constituents who are voting for them. It's very hard for a municipal councillor to say, I'm in big favor of this taller building here, even though we all know we need it, because the local constituents don't want it. So I think it's really critical that the federal government and provincial government continue to play an important role, use the levers at their disposal to, in some ways, help municipalities help themselves, because it can be very difficult in those instances. So, there's a variety of ways to do that, but we need to keep focused on making that happen.
And yeah, you're right. As municipalities hit certain targets, that's how the Housing Accelerator Fund funds get released to municipalities as they hit certain targets. And so we want to continue that municipalities are enabling the construction of more homes. It's very important to many of my constituents. Mr. Nybar, you mentioned maybe diversifying into other markets. How is that working out for you right now? Or have you looked at using the CETA trade agreement or the CPTPP to access markets in some of that region of the world? It's one of the fastest growing regions in the world. How's that turning out for you right now, and where do you think the government can assist you further?
Yeah, thanks for that. I think the biggest opportunity for us is for sure Asia. We're seeing a lot of opportunity there's still a lot of activity and opportunity in China through their building codes, moving to a more build with wood kind of culture, and how can we show them how to get there? Japan on the higher value, Japanese customers are going to pay good money for good wood. That's very clear. Korea, there's a strong furniture industry in Vietnam as well. So I think there's more promise for us in the Asia Pacific for sure. Europe, and Lana talked a bit about some of the EU regulations. We've got we're in the single digits in terms of what we're selling to the EU, but any diversification piece should be focused at, Asia's where the big opportunity is. And then also reminding, I was just looking at some of the stateside numbers. The state of California, 20%, this is 2020 numbers, 27% of their wood came from China, 24% from Canada. And you look at the state of New York, almost half comes from Canada, but right after Canada are Brazil, Chile, China, and then Russia. So I do think through diplomacy with our American counterparts and at the state level, and through that Team Canada kind of charm offensive, we have an opportunity to remind our American neighbors about the benefits of buying from Canada instead of Brazil or China.
Thank you very much. On to Mr. Savard-Tremblay for 2.5 minutes.
Oui, Madame. Attendez, Madame.
Just a moment. Ms. Payne. You already explained this. There's a significant impact on workers, on communities in which there are a lot of layoffs and closures. But to what extent, beyond this tangible impact, is there a lot of uncertainty related to the lack of an agreement? With the lack of an agreement, there must be a lot of restrictions on investments in certain projects and products that could be good opportunities. So to what extent do you see an impact of this uncertainty on workers and layoffs?
Absolutely. There's no doubt in my mind that the tariffs have potentially limited the kind of investment that we should have been seeing in the industry, and also the threat of these new tariffs, the 25% across the board tariff. It just creates chaos. It creates instability, and can, and I believe will, result in diverting investment away from Canada and into the United States. across not just the forest sector, but all sectors in Canada. So this is what we're facing, and it's why it's really, really important. Derek talked about the Team Canada approach. I believe that. I think we have to have a unified front in Canada on all of these things, softwood lumber and U.S. trade generally. We need to make sure that we're protecting Canadian jobs and Canadian workers through this entire process.
Parfait. Ben, écoutez, j'aurais envie dans ce cas-là, en 40 secondes.
So I have 40 seconds left, not too much time, but I'd like to ask you to finish if you could confirm something for me. So contrary to what the Americans have suspected, a public forest is not being subsidized, correct?
Yes, this is a very long question. For 40 years that we've been arguing this point with the United States. I do believe that we have a lot of work ahead of us, but I also know what's possible when Canada comes together to do what's in the best interests of Canadians. And what I'm saying is let's just get on with it and get it done.
Mr. Desjardins for 2.5 minutes.
Lana, I really appreciate it. Let's just get it done. I think that's the approach that we took after World War II for many of our industries when we had created hundreds of corporations here in Canada to make certain that our soldiers across the ocean had what they needed, whether it was lumber, steel, or iron. We were able to produce that. Canada, little tiny Canada, barely 30 million people, was able to produce the largest merchant navy in the globe while also supplying our men and women overseas with every bit of raw material they needed, including material that was produced right here. I think that is a far cry from where we're at today with softwood lumber, but I don't think it's something that's beyond our reach. I think that Mr. Lee can have his products for his construction at the cheapest price possible because we've supported groups like Mr. Niebuhr and his industry in producing value-added products, and hopefully we've done a good enough job as a country to ensure that we create a foundation for forestry and softwood lumber where they can actually be seen not just domestically but internationally as a competitive force. My colleague from the Bloc Québécois mentions one of the root causes of this trade dispute related to this idea of subsidy, that all of our crown forests are this big, great subsidy that has to be protected from American softwood lumber industries or their big lobby. Of course, I disagree with that. I do think that Americans need our lumber tremendously, and I think that in many ways this is Trump's way of trying to create a positive surplus for himself. It has nothing to do, I think, with the fact that he's failed at the borders to secure America. That's not our problem. It's his job to secure the American borders. What he wants to see is his industries benefit through the trade imbalance that currently exists. Canada has a surplus, partly because of our great industries and how competitive we are, and we're being punished for that. That's inappropriate. That's not an okay thing to do. That's not what friends do to other friends. This is why I agree with the Team Canada approach. I think that we do need to see that. It needs to put front and center what is valuable for Canadians, which is our jobs. The union jobs that are there is the most valuable and important piece to this puzzle for me. And so to Ms. Payne, in terms of Team Canada approach, you had just witnessed Justin Trudeau, our Prime Minister, head to the United States. He came back, unfortunately, without what I think the answers that we were hoping for. What do you think needs to be the question we pose to our Prime Minister at this point?
A very brief comment back, please. There's 16 seconds remaining.
I don't think that any of us had an expectation that the Prime Minister was going to be able to get a deal with the President-elect in one dinner meeting. But I do expect...
But an answer. We're hoping to get some answers. That was the word I used.
Thank you very much. I'm trying to complete this round. Mr. General for 2 minutes, and then Mr. Arya for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Derek, Kevin, and Lana for being with us here today. It sure is great to hear from all of you. I'm hoping to get 2 quick questions in. Ms. Payne, we heard from testimony last week that there was 90,000 jobs lost in the sector, and you had mentioned the significant impact that it had on your organization. Do you know how many of those 90,000 jobs were Unifor jobs?
We have been losing forestry jobs for decades right now, and this is why we have been talking about the need to have a proper industrial strategy to build and protect the jobs we have today, but also create new jobs.
For sure, I don't want to cut you off. I know we're at the very end, but hoping that if there's a number, we could get it. If you don't have it today, if we could send it to the committee, it would be great.
I sure can. There's tens of thousands of jobs that have been lost in the forestry sector over the last number of decades.
Unifor jobs.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. And quickly to actually probably both you, Derek and Kevin, you had mentioned that the cost of lumber now $26,000 more than the pre-pandemic. Kevin, during your opening testimony, do you know, and have you done any analysis on how many fewer homes that has impacted?
No, we can't. We can't do that analysis because it's been up and down in terms of different prices, interest rates, all of those things. But we do know when material prices go up, it does obviously make it more difficult to buy homes, build more homes, et cetera. So it's a challenge.
For 2 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, Ms. Payne mentioned 90,000 jobs lost in the sector. I just want to remind the committee that during the last meeting, the Employers Association mentioned the workers get around $70,000 to $100,000 in salary. And they also mentioned that the recent job losses was nothing to do with the trade dispute, the increase in the duties by the United States, but it was more due to the forest fires and the economic conditions. Mr. Neighbor, you did mention about the high-value products that can be sent to Japan, etc. My question is that since this dispute with the United States goes back to 1794, and how many years of dispute we are having again and again and again with the United States, why is that the industry has not started exploiting other markets across the world? We have signed free trade agreements with around 51 countries. Why the industry has not utilized that and exported? I think the exports are just around 200 million to Japan, about 100 million, I think, to European. That's it. Why the industry has not stepped up? This problem is in front of the eyes. It is affecting all. It is well known, but why the industry has not stepped up to export other parts of the world?
Well, I would say, and I'll send you the stats, but it's billions that are going to other markets, including Asia, not 100 million or 200 million. So I'm happy to send you the most recent figures from StatsCan on those shipments. I think one of the challenges, too, is the cost of competing globally. I think about the eucalyptus from Brazil that's now coming in because of the growing cycles are very fast. One of the things in Canada, it takes a long time to grow our trees. It can take 80, 90 years to grow a tree versus 15 or 10 years in some of these other markets. So I think that's one of the challenges we have. One of the other challenges we have is competing with cheap, unsustainably sourced wood from China and Russia. When it comes to exporting, prior to the Russia-Ukraine the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there were not sanctions, and Russian wood is quite predominant in being sold throughout places like Finland and other parts of Western Europe. So the competitive landscape is not easy, especially when the additional costs are being layered onto doing the way to do business in Canada. And I'm not advocating for a race to the bottom here, but the cost structure, the competitiveness structure in Canada is challenging in terms of our ability to grow markets in beyond the U.S.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you to all of you for your valuable testimony today. We will now suspend for 1 minute while our next panel of witnesses comes up for another initiative of the committee. Thank you all very much for your testimony. pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee on Thursday, May 23, 2024. The committee is commencing a study of the trade impacts of Canada's leadership in reducing emissions. And we are very happy to have with us today from the Department of Finance, Michael Mosier, Director, International Trade Policy Division, and the Department of Foreign Affairs, Trade and Development, Emmanuel Lamoureux, Director General, International Economic Policy Planning and Horizontal Issues Division, and Sean Morton, Senior Advisor, International Economic Policy Planning and Horizontal Issues Division. I'm interested to know what Horizontal Issues Division specifically is as we go through these questions. How do you get it all on a card? All right, or somebody asks who you are, and you've got to give them this long title. Anyway, welcome very much. We appreciate you taking the time out of your own schedules to come and share the information that the committee wants to know today. So we appreciate it. I understand Miss Lamoureux will be making an opening statement on behalf of the group for up to 5 minutes. So the floor is yours, Miss Lamoureux.
Thank you. Merci. Donc, bonjour à tous. Je m'appelle. Thank you. I'm the Director General of the Strategy at Foreign Affairs. My colleague has a long title. So my colleagues and I are in charge of international policy, and I'm happy to be here to talk about our involvement in the CBAM, but also give you an idea of the current landscape. My colleague from Finance is here to give you an idea of the financial impact of CBAM. That impose a carbon cost on imported goods equivalent to the carbon price paid by domestic producers. The main goal is to reduce the risk of carbon leakage, and this is when production or investments shift to jurisdictions with cheaper production costs that result from lower or no carbon pricing. CBAMs are intended to maintain a level playing field between domestic industries that are subject to carbon pricing and imported goods that are not subject to the same costs. CBAMs are also encourage greater climate ambition by motivating countries to take action to reduce carbon emissions. They are generally considered for sectors that produce significant greenhouse gas emissions and face strong competition. Donc, l'Union européenne est la première juridiction.
The European Union was the first administration to implement this type of mechanism, and it is part of the EU's toolbox to become climate neutral by 2050. The EU CBAM applies to imported goods in the aluminum, cement, electricity, fertilizer, hydrogen, iron, as well as steel sectors.
Phases. The transitional period, which began October 2023 and runs to December 31st, 2025, requires EU importers to provide information on the CBAM-covered goods to be imported. This information includes country of origin, production site, and the embedded greenhouse gas emissions for covered goods. In practice, Canadian exporters will be required to provide this information to the EU importers. During this period, no carbon fee or financial adjustment is being applied. The definitive period, which will start in January 2026, will include a requirement to report on embedded emission, and the data will need to be certified by an accredited verifier, and the carbon border charge will be imposed on the imported CBAM goods. The effective carbon price paid in the country where the goods are produced will also be deducted from the carbon border charge to avoid double pricing. Although the definitive period is set to begin in January 2026, many implementation details remain to be confirmed. For example, the European Commission is still developing how the carbon price paid in a third country will be calculated and applied, including the evidence required to demonstrate payment. Although it is EU importers that must comply with CBAM requirements, Canadian exporters will be impacted due to administrative requirements to provide verified embedded emissions data to importers. The administrative cost of those requirements on Canadian exporters is uncertain, as implementing legislation is still being developed. Donc, au-delà de l'Union européenne, il y a d'autres pays.
In addition to the EU, other countries are considering CBAMs as well. Last month, the United Kingdom confirmed the introduction of its own CBAM by January 1st, 2027. It will cover imports in the same sectors as the EU CBAM.
Exploring a variety of policy tools to address carbon leakage, which may include a CBAM. A decision is expected in 2025. As the CBAM landscape continues to evolve globally, we can expect that this will have implications for Canadian exporters in emissions-intensive sectors. The proliferation of border carbon adjustments could also lead to a patchwork of unique CBAM requirements, which risk having a major impact on trade flows and creating burdensome administrative procedures and costs for Canadian exporters. That's why Canadian officials continue to closely monitor CBAM developments and to engage with partners as these measures are being developed. To inform our advocacy efforts to advance Canadian interests, we collaborate closely with experts from other federal departments, seek input from provinces and territories and industry stakeholders. We also continue to advocate with our trading partners who are considering CBAM measures on the need to consider industrial carbon price paid in Canada when the CBAM carbon border charge is calculated. Nous continuons aussi à insister sur le
We also continue to emphasize that CBAMs need to be consistent with international trading obligations. Thank you, and I will be happy to answer your questions.
Thank you very much. We will open it up with Mr. Williams for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for being here today. Ms. Lamoureux, we want to talk about trade and some of the statistics we've been looking across the whole field of trade and economic development in Canada, especially the last 9 years. I want us to talk specifically, perhaps, with looking at the Americans right now and some of the shift. So you're responsible for international economic policy planning. When we look at what's happening with the Americans and this issue, do we see the new administration enacting a price on carbon or a CBAM at this point?
So on CBAM, with respect to the U.S. administration, the incoming U.S. administration, as far as I know, has made no mention of such an intention. There are currently before the current Congress a number of bills that consider those matters, but it is unclear whether they will be reintroduced under the new Congress.
Have we looked this far when we've been developing CBAM? You've talked about the European Union, maybe Australia, maybe the UK. But how would this affect our competitiveness if Canada had a CBAM and the Americans did not?
With respect to a Canadian CBAM, so we don't I would turn to my colleague from the Minister of Finance. The Ministry of Finance, we are not currently, in the process of doing this. In terms of impacting our competitiveness, I would flag that the EU is the first jurisdiction to put in place such a mechanism. They are still developing their legislation, so the impact of various CBAMs actually implemented is unknown at this stage. We are observing the situation in the EU to determine the impact of Canada's competitiveness. But as I flagged earlier, there is an administrative burden with respect to the implementation of the EU CBAM, which could impact the competitiveness of Canadian-made products.
So, Mr. Mosier, I'll have you comment on that. Is Canada then going to be implementing something similar to the EU, yes or no?
So at this time, the government has not taken any specific position on moving ahead with the CBAM. We have done a good amount of work on this in the past. For example, we've held consultations in 2021 on the potential to undertake a Canadian CBAM, broad-based consultations that we released a paper exploring border carbon adjustments in Canada that is still available. But to date, we continue to assess sort of what we heard in those consultations. There are a number of factors to go through, and I'm happy to speak to those.
Sure, and so I'm just going to go back to the government at hand actually promised in their last election platform to implement a CBAM. So you're saying there's no plans, but the government promised to implement this. Why would you be doing consultations if there's no plan to implement it?
I think the government's, in Budget 2020 is when it first came out, the government indicated its intent to study the potential for a border carbon adjustment mechanism in Canada, and that's what's been happening to date. And we continue to undertake that study and talk to partners and look at that.
One of the charts we do look at, or one of the, I guess, statistics we look at is the sharp decline in business investment per capita in Canada versus the U.S., especially since COVID-19. We've seen a sharp increase from the American side and a sharp decline from the Canadian side. The carbon tax has been implemented and continues to increase. This year, in April 1st, will increase 19%. Is something we do study, and it seems to be that when we look at the Americans, they don't have a price on carbon or a carbon tax. We do. It's one of the biggest when we look at causation. May not always mean equal correlation, but it does seem so on this point. Would you see this as another barrier for businesses? And if so, will this cost anything to businesses if CBAM is implemented?
So to the extent the CBAM is implemented in Canada, generally where we've seen CBAMs, they are linked to the domestic carbon price. So to the extent the price is applied to Canadian industry, those specifically trade-exposed, emissions-intensive sectors, we always think about steel, aluminum, fertilizer, those sorts of things. A CBAM can help to ensure that importers would pay the same price as domestic producers within the Canadian market. So that's certainly something we would look at as, our colleagues from Environment and Climate Change Canada, adjust the carbon price applied to those sectors. That is certainly something we would continue to take into account.
So the main question of that then is, does that make Canadian businesses more or less competitive if they're adding these prices to their bottom line?
To the extent a price is applied to Canadian businesses that is not applied to foreign importers of the same products, I would say less competitive. I would say there are a number of measures to address what we call carbon leakage or competitiveness concerns imposed by Environment and Climate Change Canada, primarily the allocation of free emissions allowances to our emissions-intensive and trade-exposed sectors. And that is how Canada has, to date, managed this issue.
Mr. Sheehan.
Thank you very much to the presenters for this information and the questions. I'd like to thank my colleague Manny for bringing this to the Trade Committee for us to delve into. It certainly is interesting. I'm from Sault Ste. Marie, and we have Algoma Steel and Tenaris Tubes there. And Algoma Steel has decided, along with a lot of the Canadian steel producers, I'm co-chair of the All-Party Steel Caucus, to decarbonize, to go from coal process to an electric arc. In the Sioux, they're going to reduce their emissions by 70%. It's like taking 1 million cars off the road, gas-powered cars. And I've been hearing from not just the steel producers, but the unions, United Steelworkers, about how, for instance, China can produce their steel so cheaply, not just because of poor labor practices, to say the least, but they use dirty coal, and they have basically, it's the wild, wild west without hardly any regulations as it relates to the environment, which creates that cheap, unfairly traded steel. So how would a CBAM, and I'm going to delve into a little bit further, because even without the CBAM, we've placed a 25% tariff on the Chinese steel because, and on aluminum as well, and 100% on electric vehicles. But I'll stay on steel and aluminum. How would the CBAM go hand in glove with the 25% tariff in your mind?
I think I'll answer, given it's more about a Canadian CBAM and how that would go hand in glove with that. I mean, it's a good question. Obviously, when we put the 25% surtax on steel products from China, part of the government's rationale was that there were lax environmental policies. And so I think, if Canada wanted to move forward with a CBAM against China, that's something that would really have to be better understood. I think CBAMs that, as those that you see in the European Union, for example, are very much, they're very technical, they're very detailed, they gather a lot of information on the product-specific emissions contained within those. And so I think it would certainly be certainly a larger administrative process to gather those emissions and to link them to a potential Canadian, or not a potential, but to link them to a Canadian carbon price. Whereas the surtax on steel and aluminum was more a measure that just sort of made the statement that these were problems and imposed the surtax.
And just because we're on the topic and it's in the news everywhere, I think it was important to be lockstep with the United States because they have a very similar program of 25% and 100% as it relates to duties on China, to make sure that we are not a backdoor. That is always a real clear and present danger with the United States. If they see you as a backdoor, they'll have problems with you. And so one of the things I wanted to ask then, let's go on to carbon leakage mitigation. What specific industries? So I understand steel and the aluminum, I understand the auto sector, the supply chains, but what specific industries in Canada are more at risk of carbon leakage, other than the ones I've mentioned?
Sure. So when we look at this, we typically look at iron and steel, aluminum, fertilizer industry, cement, chemicals, and pulp and paper as our key emissions intensive, but also trade exposed industries. Those where we have a lot of imports and those where a lot of the things we make in Canada are actually exported. So where they're in real competition with foreign products.
So and then supplementary to that question is how can the federal government work with the provinces and the territories to implement BCA measures that mitigate, these risks effectively? We were just talking about the forest industry and how the province and the feds have different things.
Another good question. I think, ultimately, it would be tariff policy, so it would be a federal jurisdiction. But I think, there's certainly a role for the provinces to play. A number of the provinces have their own carbon pricing regime, and I think any border carbon adjustment that Canada may adopt would need to be reflective of the various carbon pricing regimes we have in Canada. There are numerous depending on the province and territory. And so I think there would need to be some work there to make sure that a border carbon adjustment reflected the carbon price.
Incentives or supports might the government provide to help emission-intensive industries transition without compromising jobs or trade, other than what we did at Algoma Steel?
It's a little beyond me. As a trade policy expert to talk about government supports and subsidies. Yeah.
Champagne kind of thing to
I think so.
To look at. Okay. 50 seconds remaining. Thank you. On the whole trade, implementing this, what are the risks that the government of Canada has if we implement this to its industries? So answer that, please.
So, I'll go back to what we heard in consultations because I think it was, interesting to hear some of the risks that were raised. So certainly I think some of the risks are with respect to the U.S., and these are the key ones, right? The U.S. does not have a border carbon price. And if Canada implemented one, we would ostensibly be applying a border carbon price to imports from the United States. And I think what we heard from a lot of Canadian industry was their concerns about potential retaliation from the United States if Canada implemented something like that. We also heard about administrative complexity and just the compliance burden, noting Canada does have, a number of different carbon prices and how that would be complied with. It is a very large data gathering exercise, so there was concern about that. And then, of course, there are downstream impacts. So to the extent a border carbon price applies to our imports and they're used by industry and ultimately purchased by consumers, that can have the impact of raising those costs as well. So there were a number of risks.
Thank you very much. Mr. Savard-Tremblay for 6 minutes, please.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Merci.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to our witnesses for being here with us. In 2020, there was an initial report to look at the pan-Canadian approach on carbon pricing. In this report, it's indicated in terms of carbon leakage and competitiveness that the tools that are currently being used on a political level for carbon pricing, this was 2020 when this was stated, the current tools at the time didn't seem to have controlled the risks. They also say in the report that the carbon pricing had gone up to over $170 per ton, but that this was necessary. So do we need to look into, or rather, have we looked into these measures since this report, and do you have any numbers pertaining to carbon leakage? And do we have plans to work on this in the future?
Juste pour être clair, votre question.
So just to be clear, you're talking about the domestic level or the international level? Either one.
Tout est assez interrelié dans une planète.
It's all very interconnected in today's world. So I'm not familiar with the report that you mentioned, but pertaining to additional measures, I would imagine that the mechanism that is being implemented in the EU is being considered by other administrations currently, and I would assume that this is included in the toolbox of any country to continue to limit these risks. So we can see this in other countries currently. We are keeping an eye on these different regions because we don't want this to place too heavy an administrative burden on our exporters. So Canada is committed to international discussions to ensure that we are working, that these different carbon mechanisms are working together and are streamlined to prevent this heavy burden on our exporters. So I know you said that you're not familiar with the report, which is no problem, but they stated that if there is an agreement between Canada's measures and our key partners, there would need to be a coordination measure to prevent this harming Canada's competitiveness. So, to your knowledge, are there agreements with partners that are critical, and what would the impact be of these agreements? What I can say is that in discussions with all administrations that are considering or are implementing a carbon border adjustment mechanism are present in these discussions. And we're talking about all different levels here to ensure that the carbon price that's paid by exporters in Canada is fully recognized at the border, at the EU, for example, and other administrations that are considering similar mechanisms. So we're doing this work through our embassies, but we have been working at the departmental levels as well. So this is bilateral and multilateral work to focus on this interoperability. Are there any gray areas concerning what might be implemented? For example, nuclear power. We're not talking about a lot of carbon, but it still has significant environmental risks. So could there still be an elephant in the room with these mechanisms? For the time being, the European Union decided to step away from this sector that was mentioned. Now, who knows if at some point the EU would decide to expand the number of industries that are affected by this. I would imagine that they will consider this, but we've been told that they wouldn't do this before January 1st, 2026. So if they expand this to other industries, it would be in the future. So firstly, there would be the implementation January 1st, 2026 to the mentioned industries, and then following that, we could expect that it would take some time before they would evaluate it further. On your end, if the EU implements this January 1st, 2026, do you have an agenda that you're working with? So it would be January 1st, 2026. That's the second phase date. Just to clarify, yes. But on your end, well, our agenda continues to be reevaluated. We've been working with them the entire time to ensure that exporters' interests be advocated for and to ensure that the price that is being paid in Canada be recognized and that this be done in an equitable and fair manner for our exporters. The goal is to create a level playing field and to prevent carbon leakage. So we respect this goal, and we don't want our Canadian exports to be at a disadvantage. Mr. Desjardins?
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being present in the study today. You spent a lot of time on the carbon border adjustment mechanism, and part of what I think your departments and many of those engaged in international trade on behalf of Canada are aware of is, of course, the huge commitments relative to the Paris Climate Change Accord. At that time, many signatories, of course, had committed to this global pricing mechanism that would look at transfer of goods beyond borders and look at carbon pricing between borders. Where and when, if anything, what are some of the concrete foundational principles of a global framework? And does the European Union's process recognize those principles or create fairness, or does it actually do the opposite?
I think a portion of your question would be better answered by ECCC, like Environment Canada, Climate Change Canada. But sorry, can you just repeat the last portion of your question? Because I think I was able to answer that.
Let's call it precedent that's been set by the European Union in some ways. Their process of adjustment, is that beneficial for trading partners that have existing trading relationships, or is that actually hindering trade?
So certainly, as I mentioned, the legislation is still under development, but they have been clear that their intention is to apply a mechanism that respects international trade law. So that's reassuring to us. So that means a process that is fair, transparent, and does not impose an undue administrative burden on exporters from other countries. So we are, of course, holding them to account on this. We're making sure that that is the case. I mean, to the extent the same measures are applied to all exporters, there is a certain fairness, but we are in constant touch with them to make sure that it is the case.
And so I think it was Michael's point earlier related to the carbon pricing mechanisms here domestically in Canada, and to my Conservative colleague's question related to relative disadvantage or advantage that trading partners would have between that the trade imbalance that a carbon price domestically could have with another trading partner. And maybe to Michael, can you please clarify your remarks related to my Conservative colleague's question regarding the impact of the climate pricing mechanism here in relation to subsidy, if it amounts to that, through some kind of mechanism like this, the Canada border, or the carbon border adjustment mechanism?
Sure, so happy to speak a little bit to the relative competitiveness impacts, and please correct me if I'm not answering specifically. So, I mean, I think the concern and what a border carbon adjustment does is, to the extent that price is applied to domestic production, the border carbon adjustment would ensure that producers pay the same price for the embedded carbon. And so, I think in Canada to date, ECCC has sought to manage that, and they should really speak more to this, but through what's called the free allowances, through the output-based pricing system. And that's how ECCC has sought to manage carbon leakage risk within Canada to date for our emissions-intensive trade-exposed industries.
Sorry.
No, please.
And to put it in a different way, I suppose, the mechanism that's used domestically and the adjustments that are made for, in other words, output, are different.
I'm not sure I understand your question with respect to
So the carbon pricing mechanism that exists for goods here in Canada, when you want to export a good, let's say, and you're paying that carbon price on those goods in the production of those goods by seconding materials and paying a price on those materials, when you want to export it or when you want to ship it out or sell it, you're saying there's a process that deals with that pricing mechanism at the point of sale when it's being exported, correct? There's a process to deal with the competitiveness at the border.
Right. So is there an export credit to refund the carbon price, I guess is your question. So I think, and Emmanuel can talk to this, where we've seen, I mean, anything is possible, but I think where we've seen carbon prices, enforced to date in the EU, the UK, that sort of thing, an export credit has not typically been part of the carbon price. It's really an adjustment applied to imports to make sure that everyone that sells within the domestic market, within Canada, pays the same price. But the table fell open there.
Broke? Oh, okay.
But we wouldn't typically see an export credit applied to Canadian exports going into the world market. I think there would be a lot of questions and concerns, perhaps my global affairs colleagues speak to about, trade concerns that our partners would have and compliance with international agreements and that sort of thing.
Sure.
No, I think what I was going to add, I wanted to add a bit more detail on how the EU CBAM is actually calculated, because it does take into consideration various factors, including total embedded emissions, of course, but also price paid under EU's emissions trading system and carbon pricing paid by the exporter in the country of origin. So it's really to avoid double pricing. So there is an adjustment that is made at the border. Not everyone, of course, pays the same amount depending on how the good is produced. So.
Thank you very much. Mr. Baldinelli, please, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'd like to thank the witnesses for being with us today. It's an interesting study, and today's the first, and it's great to get that information. Now, Mr. Mosier, I'd like to follow up with you because you had mentioned consultations had taken place with industry and individuals as well. I think you also mentioned some of the provinces as well. Now, has a report been prepared, shared with government? Are there recommendations within that? I mean, is that a public document that could be shared with us?
To date, there's been no sort of what we heard document published by the government from those consultations.
Now, you had mentioned because of those consultations, but you can refer to some of the comments that you've heard. So what are some of the comments that you've heard from industry stakeholders, Steel Association, Cement Association of Canada, those high-intensity carbon producers? What have they shared with government with regards to this?
Sure. So we've had a number of discussions, including those consultations and since. I would say there was some interest, certainly, from those industries in Canada thinking more about a border carbon adjustment, where decarbonization presents costs, and especially where, carbon leakage risk is more prominent, where they're more trade exposed, that sort of thing. However, I would say that they were only really interested in those border carbon adjustment as long as Canada retained its existing measures to address carbon leakage. So the output-based pricing system and the allocation of those emission allowances that would allow the steel and aluminum industries to remain competitive, particularly as they export to the U.S. market.
Now, you had also mentioned the notion of and concerns of potential risks. The U.S., for example, not having one. I mean, they're our largest trading partner. We do more in trade with the United States than we do with the rest of the world combined. So, I mean, from a trade perspective, you would imagine harmonization with what goes on with our largest trading partner would be a priority. So were those comments shared directly?
It's a perfect segue. That was my next point. So I think almost ubiquitously, all the industry we spoke with talked about the need for Canada to align with the United States on this. The concerns about retaliation were certainly front of mind, but I think also an understanding that Canada and the U.S. do trade a lot of these goods. For the emissions-intensive goods I spoke about, those 6 categories, in some categories, 100% of our exports go to the U.S., but in most, it's very, very high. And so alignment with the U.S. and ensuring continued open lines of trade and that there's not new trade barriers erected was very, very front of mind for the industry.
You also mentioned potential retaliation concerns and administrative complexities. Are there others that you could share with us?
No, I think those two would be my next points, and then that we also heard about the importance of designing, for example, a border carbon adjustment that would be consistent with Canada's international trade obligations. And then, of course, we did hear from a number of folks, and I spoke about it earlier, about the potential increase in costs, the impacts on downstream producers who would use inputs and the costs on consumers. But certainly, I would reiterate, administrative burden was something that came up over and over again, and the importance of not increasing costs, but also not hindering trade at the border.
Now, again, with the United States, and you have a new administration, so we're unaware of what their policy moving forward with. But so if they go forward with no position on a CBAM, for example, they're not going to implement that. What is the impact, do you believe, on the EU and their steps going forward. Are they still committed to going forward? Because some incoming U.S. administration could then just take the position of tariffs in response. And so have you done any investigations on that or looked into that matter?
Our sense is that the EU very much intends to move forward with its CBAM. It's under implementation already. We're in the first phase of implementation, although the charges are not in place yet. So as far as we know, they are moving forward with this. Mm-hmm.
Madam Chair, how much time would I have?
16 seconds, so I'm sorry you don't have any
Well,
time,
okay.
Mr. Aria.
Well, thank you for appearing today.
At least 16 seconds. With the globalization and the international trade agreements, international trade as we knew, fast receding, how difficult you think it is that we can, is it possible to achieve consensus, a global consensus on this carbon border adjustment mechanism or anything similar to that?
Certainly, it will be challenging, but what we are seeing now is a movement towards the adoption of such mechanism. Among an increasingly, a number of countries that is increasing. So I've mentioned, the EU, which is the most advanced, but also the UK, which, will follow shortly after. Australia is also considering it, Japan as well. As I mentioned earlier, the challenge there will be interoperability. A consensus on how exactly to make these mechanisms work together to limit the administrative burden on exporters, and so that those mechanisms, which intention is to prevent carbon leakage and encourage greener industries, so that they don't become unintentional barriers to trade, especially for SMEs.
You mentioned you see a movement towards by the international partners, but the elephant in the room is the U.S., and the biggest and growing market is the Global South, especially Indo-Pacific thing. So with we going ahead with countries like U.S. or the Indo-Pacific countries not doing it, do you think we'll be ever be able to achieve our objectives?
I just want to make sure that I understand this question correctly. If the EU will be able to attain their objective, if we...
EU, UK, maybe Australia tomorrow, and Japan day after are moving towards this, which is a good thing. But with the US not considering this, or the Global South, especially the Indo-Pacific region, which is the biggest growing market, that's where our focus is. Do you think, what is the outcome you expect from that?
So if the objective is to level the playing field, I think they may succeed in that objective. If the objective is to reduce, global emissions worldwide, of course, not having, some of the largest players on board will be a challenge. So I would say partially.
And how difficult it is to measure, these emissions, the carbon embedded in products. Suppose we get something from, say, Nigeria or something from Vietnam. How difficult it is for us to measure it?
So it can be challenging, and that's something that the EU is recognizing, and that's why they are allowing for two methods to report on those carbon emissions. The first one is, which is the most accurate one, is to report on the actual emission data, but it's also resource intensive. It requires, some data.
Solution is not near term.
Okay, but I was going to say there's also an option for a default value for countries who may not have the or exporters who may not have the research capacity.
Have you heard, or do you think you're going to hear from our trading partners that we are using this as a protectionist measure?
Some partners have raised concerns. It's hard for them to be definitive because the EU CBAM is not in place yet and the legislation is still under development. But certainly several countries are very much, engaged on this.
The U.S., we have
30
already seen
seconds.
Russia.
30 seconds
Okay.
remaining.
So we have seen Russia using trade as it has weaponized the trade. We have also seen the U.S. currently, using the trade tariffs as a weapon against what they got a problem with their immigration. So where do you think it will all lead to?
A very brief answer. How's that?
Well, that's a tough question. I think we need to be mindful of our international trade obligations in this, challenging context that you described, and avoid, obviously, a race to the bottom. But, yeah.
Thank you very much. Mr. Savard-Tremblay for 2.5 minutes.
Oui, merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Earlier you talked about Chinese tariffs. For Canada, have we considered anything? Is there a plan to ensure that, if we don't have an internal measure, then maybe there could be a workaround for this?
Quand vous dites les produits qui n'ont pas de mesure.
So you said products that don't have an internal measure. I meant products coming from countries that don't have their own internal measure. Yes, so Canada does have its own internal measures. In terms of countries that do not, well, that will be taken into account at the border at the EU, meaning that they're going to request the relevant data. And then in certain situations, they will have to pay more than that which those who produced it and didn't yet pay for those emissions. In terms of Canada, have we envisioned something like this yet?
Well, so I think for Canada, when we think about a border carbon adjustment mechanism, and we do our analysis here, that is something that would be taken into consideration. I think you were speaking with respect to the recent surtaxes on China, if I have that correct. Canada would have the option, I suppose, of looking at products that were imported from other countries and considering its tools. Section 53 of the customs tariff surtax being one of those tools, although I'm not sure if there would certainly be other factors to take into consideration.
Another question. Let's look to the American side. There will be a new president. He's going to be repealing certain measures. In his first mandate, he abolished other things. In terms of environmental protection, in April, he would like to make many coal plants get below 80% emissions, or some of them may actually have to close down. With discussions that you've had with the Americans, are there concerns pertaining to potential carbon pricing changes?
Malheureusement, je ne serai pas en mesure de répondre.
Unfortunately, I can't answer the question because I do not participate in discussions with the United States on these topics.
Desjardins for 2.5.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I've given notice of a motion I'd like to move at this point. Given that, A, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action include creating economic opportunities for Indigenous Canadians so they can fully participate in society. B, Canada, along with Australia, New Zealand, and Taiwan, endorsed the Indigenous Peoples Economic Trade Cooperation Agreement, also known as IPECA, on December 10th, 2021, which, quote, acknowledges the importance of Indigenous economic empowerment through inclusive approaches to trade and working together to identify and remove the barriers that Indigenous businesses face when participating in international trade, end quote. And C, it is unclear how this agreement has been implemented. that the committee undertake a study of no fewer than 5 meetings to study how IPECA can serve as a framework to improve cooperation and trade between Canada's Indigenous peoples and Indigenous peoples across the globe, and that the Minister of Export Promotion, International Trade and Economic Development and the Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations be invited to appear as witnesses.
Thank you very much. So you had given us notice of motion. You've now introduced it. Would you, we are doing committee business on Wednesday afternoon, yes, in committee. Would you be okay to defer the debate and discussion till that time?
Unless,
okay?
if my colleagues have questions about it, or we could go to a vote now if you're already prepared.
Well, I think we're trying
and
to
just
complete
dispose of
this.
it.
Otherwise, if we could just wait until Wednesday to deal with it, is there?
Sure. Yep, Wednesday works for me, Madam Chair.
Wednesday's fine, because we have also a notice
do
of
Wednesday.
motion from Mr. Williams as well. And we'll deal with both of them on Wednesday afternoon, our committee business.
Very
So
good,
that's-
let's do that.
That's good with everybody? Okay, so you still have a bit of time left.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, hold on.
Oh, sorry.
I would just like to say that the interpreters said that they did not receive the motion. However, we did receive it. So I would ask that when we do receive written motions, that we also send them to the interpreters, please.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, for sure. Okay, the floor is back to you, Mr. Desjardins.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and I'll agree with my colleague from the Bloc Québécois, and I apologize to the interpreters for that document not being present and readily available for our Francophone speakers here. Sorry about that. My final question, I suppose, I know we'll have a couple more meetings on this. It's related to a question that Mr. Arya had posed, which was the complex nature of trying to impose such a framework internationally. What is the number one barrier to creating such a framework?
I don't know if I would be in a position to comment on the number one barrier, but I think it's the fact, some of the factors are certainly the fact that different carbon pricing approaches exist in different countries, that maybe the sectors that different countries who are considering CBAMs are focusing on may be different. For example, Australia's sectors, the sectors they might consider are different from the EU ones. So it's really an alignment of approaches.
Is there any time remaining, Chair? 50 seconds. Oh, wonderful. In relation to that model, I'm certain it would be one of the greatest issues relative to major countries that are increasing their carbon pricing at different rates. I'm certain that in addition to your question about models, there's also a greater complexity when it comes to when those rates change or when those rates are imposed. That alone would create a significant barrier, I'd imagine, which is probably why you're coming to this in your opening statement, speaking to the administrative concern or the administrative burden of such a project, correct?
Yes, and the issue also as to how it's calculated, right? So there's a number of considerations that play into the challenges posed by interoperability.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry your time is up. I'm on to Mr. Genero for 4 minutes, please.
4 minutes, great. Thanks, Madam Chair. Hoping to get, I guess, back to Mr. Mosier. You mentioned something earlier today to one of my colleagues' questions. There was consultation started in August 2021, correct? And then there's no document, so to speak, of those consultations. You have shared some of that with us. I guess my question is, why isn't there a document, so to speak, on what happened in those consultations?
I mean, I can't speak to all consultations. Sometimes the government produces a document when it makes sense. In this case, I think, it didn't make sense from the government's perspective. There was a lot of, concerns on both sides that were raised, and it really went into the analysis that has sort of been ongoing. I mean, we've spoke today about some of the concerns with respect to some of our trade partners, but beyond that, I can't answer your question specifically.
I guess I'm still confused because you public consultations, so to speak, correct? Yes, public consultations. People come in, tell the government their opinion on things. Maybe it doesn't work as well as what thought it was. Then suddenly there's just nothing that we get to see. It's fair. Like you're in front of us, so I'm putting you on the spot. However, was this a direction at some point saying, well, let's just not share this information?
Not that I'm aware of. I mean, I don't have more information, to be honest, to answer your question. Sorry.
Okay. So presumably there's something there. Like there's somebody wrote something down, that something is sitting somewhere, and I guess that would be important for this committee to know and to have, because at the end of the day, that is essentially what we're trying to get to the basis of. I don't know, Madam Chair, if we have the ability to say, send us documents, please. But this certainly seems like something we should probably have access to at the end of the day. So, Mr. Mosier, I guess can you, and I'll ask you nicely, can you please send something back to the committee without going through the necessary forcing of the documents to be here? But it just seems mind-boggling that there's nothing available right now.
Certainly. I'd be happy to take that back and see what we can provide to the committee. Thank you.
Okay, all right. I think we'll revisit that at some point, Madam Chair. Quickly to Ms. Lamoureux and maybe Mr. Morton, because your title is Senior Advisor, Mr. Morton. Is it your advice to the Minister right now to not move forward with CBAM?
CBAM for Canada?
Yes.
So being at Global Affairs, it would not be under our remit to make that recommendation. We are looking at the impact of foreign CBAMs on Canadian exports. So,
but it says your
sorry.
advisors, and it says, I suspect there's some advice to be given on
I'm
this.
sorry, Ms. Tried to stretch the time. Ms. Fortier, please, for 4 minutes. If the witnesses can just be patient for a couple of more minutes, please. I realize we're going over. Ms. Fortier.
Merci, Madame la Présidente, et merci.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for being with us here today to help us better understand this issue. I'm trying to understand the benefits and the impact of this, and I think you've largely responded to this. I don't know if my question will be too simple. Currently, we're looking at the EU, our third most important trade partner. So we're looking at this climate policy alignment with the EU. What are the essential benefits for Canada with this alignment? The benefits of a Canadian CBAM? Is that what you mean? Yes.
I'm struggling because CBAMs are typically made to address the domestic market situation, right? And so to the extent Canada would consider implementing a CBAM, it would ensure that within the domestic market, Canadian producers' products face the same sort of charge on embedded carbon emissions as foreign producers.
Mais c'est un bénéfice pour les entreprises.
But is this beneficial for companies to do this, given that this would allow them to continue to do business with the EU? This is what we're trying to see, if it is beneficial or not to companies, because if we want to continue to thrive, if we want our economy to continue to grow, I just want to know that whether or not this will be beneficial for companies if we follow the EU's approach.
I can. Non, je peux évidemment, moi, c'est pas de mes responsabilités de commenter sur.
It's not one of my responsibilities to comment on a Canadian CBAM, but we are looking very closely at the EU CBAM results. And they're the first administration to implement this, so this helps us to understand what are the advantages, what are the potential issues with it or gaps. We're looking to see how this complies with international law. And of course, there will be lessons to learn from this on our end. We said this in other studies. There is a lot of red tape in Canada, and this would be potentially additional red tape. So the goal would not be to increase the administrative burden for companies. Currently, we're looking at if there are a lot of advantages, then we'll move forward with this to ensure that companies are winning in this equation.
I mean, I think to speak to the potential for, additional administrative burden and that sort of thing and how it could impact companies, I mean, certainly importers of products would be required to produce documents showing their embedded emissions. I think, how a CBAM for Canada, if it was implemented, would be designed, there's still some open questions. But what we've seen, for example, in the EU is a lot of data gathering within the EU and EU companies and their products to set a baseline to understand that the price they pay on their embedded emissions. And so, if Canada followed the same approach, there would be, an additional sort of administrative data gathering burden imposed on Canadian businesses to make sure we understand the production.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to our colleagues. Thank you to the witnesses for your valuable information. We appreciated your patience and being here this morning. We will, just for the committee's information, we will have committee business at the end after we do some work on our draft study on CUSMA and the supply chains on Wednesday. Right, so there'll be the three different things, including committee business. All right? Okay, meeting adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.